The Second Year, Part 5. Pat snubbed Suzanne when the later telephoned down to ask her and Sid to their housewarming. She could not go because she had another engagement for the evening, which was quite true, for, knowing that the housewarming was coming off, she had promised to go to a dance in South Glen. And when Suzanne and David came down the hill path one evening on their way to a moonlit concert which the boarders at the Bayshore Hotel were giving on the North Glen sandshore, and asked Pat to go with them, she was entirely gracious and aloof and very sorry she couldn't possibly go, with no more excuse than that, though in her heart she wanted to go. But something in her had been hurt too deeply. She could never forgive a jibe at Silverbush, as unlucky Lester Conway had discovered years ago, and she took a bitter delight in refusing very sweetly. Oh, terrible polite she was, Judy reported to Tilly Tuck. Judy was just as well pleased that this threatened friendship with the Longhouse people seemed unlikely to materialize. Widowers do be sly, terrible sly, she reflected. Suzanne was not one of those who could not take a hint, and Pat was troubled with no more invitations. The lights gleamed in the long house at evening, but Pat resolutely turned her eyes away from them. Music drifted down the hill when Suzanne played on her violin in the garden under the stars, but Pat shut her ears to it. And yet she felt by times a strange hint of loneliness. Just now and then came a queer, hitherto unknown feeling, expressed by the deadly word drab, as if life were made of grey flannel. Then she felt guilty. Life at Silverbush could never be that. She wanted nothing but Silverbush and her own family. Nothing. Ray contributed a bit to the comedy of living that summer by having a frightful attack of schoolgirl veal love, the object of which was a young evangelist who was holding revival meetings in Mr. Jonas Monkham's big barn. He did not approve of organized churches, and these services were in the nature of a free-for-all, and, being very lively of their kind, attracted crowds, some whom came to scoff and remained to pray, for it could not be denied that the young preacher had a very marked power for stirring the emotions of his hearers to concert pitch. He had an exceedingly handsome, marble-white face, with rather too large, too soft, too satiny brown eyes, and long, crinkly, mahogany-hued hair, sweeping back in a mane from what Ray once incautiously said was a noble brow, and a remarkably caressing, wooing voice, expressive of everything. The teenagers went down like ninepins before him. A choir was collected, consisting of everybody in the two glens who could be persuaded to function. Ray, who sang sweetly, was leading soprano, looking like the very rose of song as she caroled with her eyes turned heavenward, or at least toward the banners of cobwebs hanging from the roof of the barn. She went every night, gave up teasing to be allowed to wear knickerbockers around home, and discarded costume earrings because the evangelist referred to jewelry as gods, all gods. She was tormented terribly because of her case on the preacher, but she gave as good as she got, and nobody except Pat thought it was anything but a passing crush. For that matter, all the girls were more or less in love with him, and it was difficult to tell where love left off and religion began, as Elder Robinson remarked sarcastically. But Elder Robinson did not approve of the revivals conducted by itinerant evangelists. Go preachers, he called them, and Ray and her ilk considered Elder Robinson a hide-bound old fossil. Even when Jedediah Madison of Silverbridge, who hadn't been inside of a church for years, wandered into the barn one night and was saved in 3 minutes, Elder Robinson was still incredulous of any good thing. "Let us see if it lasts," he was reported to have said, and added that he had just been reading of a very successful evangelist who had turned out to be a bank bandit. Pat had no fear that Mr. Wheeler was a bandit, but she detested him and was puzzled as alarmed over Ray's infatuation. Tilly Tuck was likewise hard-boiled and said that the meetings were merely a form of religious dissipation. Judy went one night out of curiosity, but could never be prevailed upon to go again. Mr. Wheeler played a violin solo that night, and she was horrified. No matter if the meeting was held in a barn, it was, or purported to be, divine service, and fiddles had no place in such. Neither had she any exalted opinion of the sermon. Oh, not much of a preacher, that. Sure, and I could understand every word he said." So Pat and Ray were the only ones who went regularly. Pat going because Ray was so set on it, and very soon it was bruited aboard in the glen that the Gardner girls meant to leave the Presbyterian church and join the Go Preachers. It blistered Pat's pride to hear it, and she was less than civil to Mr. Wheeler when he walked home with them after the meeting. To be sure, it was on the way to his boarding house, and he always walked by Pat and not by Ray, but Pat was the suspicious older guardian sister to the backbone. It was all very well to laugh at calf love, but Ray must be protected. It was a real relief to Pat's mind when, after 6 hectic weeks, Mr. Wheeler departed for pastures new, and Mr. Monkman's barn reverted to rats and silence. Ray continued to blush furiously for several weeks when Sid teased her about her boyfriend. Mr. Wheeler had said that he was glad to find there were still girls in the world who could blush. But nothing more came of it, and Pat's alarm subsided. Ray was asked to sing in the South Glen choir, began to experiment with the effect of her eyelashes on the tenor, and wear gauds again. And everything blew over, save for a little knot of faithful disciples who continued to hold services of their own in their homes, and would have nothing further to do with churches of any description.